All right, good morning everyone in the room, and good morning everyone, afternoon, evening around the world. So I'd like to welcome you to a side session at the 2017 Geoplenary. This is entitled Earth Observations in Support of Sustainable Development Goal Implementation and Monitoring in Small Island States and Developing Countries. And this is a side event sponsored by the Geo Blue Planet Initiative. And you'll be hearing more detail about Geo Blue Planet a little bit later. So just to introduce myself, I'm Paul DiGiacomo. I'm one of the co-chairs of the Geo Blue Planet Initiative. And here with co-chairs of this side event, Sophie Siev and Hans-Peter Plog, and you'll be hearing presentations from them both. And so I'm not going to go into an extensive monologue. I think we really just we have a very good, excellent slate of speakers and jump into them. But just a few details about this session. The event will serve as a forum for discussion between representatives of various small island states, and we're going to be abbreviating those occasionally as SISs, and developing countries, participating organizations, and other geo activities that have an interest in providing Earth observation data and related information products in support of the small island states and developing countries, and particularly associated with the 2030 agenda. The event will provide an opportunity to pinpoint challenges for the Earth observation data for these regions and to identify and formulate partnerships to address these challenges. And a particular role is going to be, particular focus is going to be on the role of the oceans for the sustainable development goals and the information needs related to the ocean. So we'll introduce the speakers one by one as we start. And Sophie, do you want to do that, or?
Yes, can I just have a couple of minutes?
Sure. So while we're doing that, I'm just going to tell you a little bit more, just briefly, about Geo Blue Planet. So Geo Blue Planet is an initiative under the auspices of GEO, the Group for Earth Observations. It was approved last year as an initiative, but really in earnest, the work has been ongoing for about, in different forms, about 10 years now. And really our focus is a variety of foci, but bringing together data providers and data users of ocean observations in support of societal benefits, and particularly in this context for sustainable development goals. In that context, one thing is we've noted, and I'm sure all of you as members of this community are familiar, that there's a number of different institutions and organizations engaged in this topic, but many of them don't know what each other is doing. So for example, you have data providers on the satellite side, data providers on the in situ side that aren't really aware of what the respective activities are. So that's one thing Blue Planet's going to try to help foster and facilitate communication, coordination between those groups, and likewise to link those groups and those users, those data providers, to the end users for a variety of different foci. We have different applications we're focusing on, including coastal regions, incredibly important for the number of people that live there, the socioeconomic implications of those regions, focusing on food security and marine ecosystems, which are changing relative to climate change and anthropogenic impacts, et cetera. We have a blue economy focus, a very big topic these days. And finally, maritime domain awareness in terms of dealing with increasing issues of shipping and transportation. And for example, you consider what's going on up in the Arctic with an ice diminished Arctic and the opening up of new shipping channels and what the opportunities but also challenges are in that regard. So just a little bit about Blue Planet. You'll hear it later. Have I stalled enough, Dr. Siev?
Yes.
Okay, so let me introduce my esteemed Blue Planet co-chair, Dr. Sophie Siev, and she'll introduce the first and following speakers. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for coming to this side event. So I'm just going to chair this next session, and I'll start by introducing our first speaker, who is Aditya Agarwal. Apologies for the pronunciation, from the Global Partnership for Sustainable Development Data. And he will be talking about data for implementation of the SDGs in small island developing states and developing countries. So if you'd like to come forward.
Thank you very much.
It's your clicker.
Okay. Great.
Flip her on the other way.
There we go. Okay. Good morning, everyone. First, let me just start by saying thank you for having me at this session. My name is Agarwal. I work for the Global Partnership for Sustainable Development Data. And what I wanted to talk to you about this morning was some of the work that we're doing on how we're working with countries to better understand what some of the demand type of issues that are happening at the country level in regards to how they're implementing against SDGs and some of the things that we're trying to do around what some of the data and technology gaps are in that context. I think for this crowd, I probably don't need to go over too much of this, but just for broader context, we're moving into the SDGs now, post MDGs, and I think some of the key issues there are that now it's a universal agenda, and we're working in a time frame where there's so much more data that's readily available through all the new technology that's accessible to a huge number of people. And then when we're looking at the SDGs, with 17 goals, 169 targets, and 230 indicators, there's huge data requirements behind all of that. And arguably, there isn't one country in the world right now that's fully prepared to be able to respond to all of that. But when we're thinking about what some of the key challenges are in terms of how data is being used, we're still facing many of the same problems that we've been facing for many years now when it comes to availability, how dynamic the data are, the level of disaggregation that's needed to really account for people and be able to make the types of decisions that are needed, its quality, usability, how open and accessible it is, and how effectively it's going to be used. And ultimately, when we're looking at data, what do we need it for? We want to be able to essentially be able to improve decision-making and influence policy, be able to have better engagement with our citizens, and be able to use that data as a conduit for better innovation and entrepreneurship. And so we have the data revolution that's going on right now. Part of the intent of the data revolution is to bring government, civil society, and private sector together and be able to unleash innovation so that you're able to have more real-time, dynamic, and disaggregated data from multiple sources be applied. And so within that context, we're working with a number of different organizations within the global partnership across a number of different data communities. So with Earth observation data, we're all here for the GeoPlenary, so it's doing a lot of work with GEO, with NASA, with European Space Agency, University of Maryland, many others, all with the idea of how do we better apply Earth observation data that's more demand-focused to really help solve some of the country-level challenges. But we're also looking at how data can be integrated across different types, so looking at citizen-generated data, big data, particularly mobile data and call data records, and then also advocating for integration with SDGs and open data programs so that becomes something that really helps develop data ecosystem type of approaches. And so the Global Partnership for Sustainable Development Data, it was launched in 2015 when the SDGs were launched. It's currently housed at the United Nations Foundation, and it has over 200 organizations that are involved across sectors that are all working towards how data and technology can be applied for good, for social good, and in this case, also the SDGs. So, within the partnership, we work across 3 different tiers. One is really how do we put data on the political agenda? The second is how do we create mechanisms to better connect supply and demand? And then the third is how do we create different types of enablers that allow for data to more freely flow? So looking at things like API and standards and data protocols and such. But one of the cornerstones of our overall process, the way that we really sort of understand how countries are approaching the SDGs, is a process that we're calling data roadmaps for sustainable development. And what we're trying to do is really push for a whole of government and a multi-stakeholder approach for how you harness the data revolution, both at national and subnational levels. And through this process, understand how SDGs are aligning to national development priorities, what are the key data gaps and technology gaps, how do other country experiences influence how countries are working, and then when we look at what are some of those gaps, how do other alternative data sources also support filling those gaps? And so the countries that we're working in right now are the ones that you see listed here. And in most cases, what countries are doing is really following a very practical approach where you're taking an international framework, aligning it to national plans and priorities, and then coming out with a localized framework. So right now in Africa, there's 5 countries that we're working with. We're coming up with a regional approach and a regional strategy for Africa. And some of the work that I'm doing now with Latin America is also working with the Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean to figure out what our strategy is going to be there. Right now, we've started working with Colombia, and Colombia, I'll show you some examples, is arguably doing a lot of innovative work in this space. But there's a lot of interest in that region, and especially as it applies to some of the small island states there, we're figuring out our approach. So part of, I think, from the global partnership perspective, one of the things that we're really trying to concentrate on is what does it mean to really get at data for action? So we want to be able to look within the official statistics perspective, how data is being applied for reporting and monitoring, but we also want to be able to see how these alternative data sources come together with official statistics in a way that you're able to really apply that data for decision making and action as well, and be able to, again, look at how real time and dynamic and disaggregated data can really support that process. So in Colombia, the way that they've approached it is they've created this traffic light index, which essentially is their data gaps assessment. So everything in green, they have data 4, which is roughly 50% of the indicators. 30 is partial, data that needs improvement. And red is about 16% where they don't have the data. And there's some correlation there with the tier 1, 2, and 3 indicators. One of the requests from the Colombian government also was for the global partnership to then also look at how tier 2 and 3 indicators could be filled. And obviously there's a really good correlation there with Earth observation data that supports that level of indicators. And I'm sure everyone here has already seen this slide, which is the mapping that Geo has done for where Earth observation data could be applied to the different targets and indicators. So in Colombia, we started this process in collaboration with GEO and NASA. The European Space Agency participated, University of Maryland, and CEOS. And the idea there was to go through an iterative process to better understand where some of the challenges are for the data that they need improvement in. The areas that they identified were around urban resilience, deforestation, land use and cover change, water resources, biodiversity, and agriculture. And so we did this workshop in March of this year, which was a really interesting workshop because it was able to better understand what was happening in Colombia across institutions, but then also as those discussions were happening across institutions, it also allowed those institutions to better understand from one another what was actually taking place. So it was a really good a way for building bridges across those institutions and building better collaboration, and then bringing in international expertise for how different types of geospatial and Earth observation methods could be applied to particular challenges. And so, part of our approach is to work with organizations like Season and from Frank Muller Karger in University of Florida to think about how these different types of geospatial methods can be applied to these country-level challenges. And so in this example on the left is, population estimates that are being done through various methods, but each at a different resolution. And then looking at marine biodiversity observation networks that Frank is working on, and he's also working on this with Colombia now. Matt Hansen and all the deforestation work that he's doing, and from Brian, looking at how data cubes and water observation data can be applied. The point is that when we're looking at all these different data communities and looking at how the SDGs are housed within national statistics, a lot of the work that I think all of us are doing is trying to bring geospatial and Earth observation methods together with national statistics. And so through this approach, being able to better understand what the specific challenges are, then we're trying to match that up with other partners that have the methods that can help solve for that. So at the UN General Assembly this year, we had a number of meetings with our country focal points. And over the next 3 years, many countries are going to be doing their population and agricultural censuses. Kenya is launching what they're calling an intergovernmental network on open data for agriculture and nutrition. There's a drought that's going on in Kenya right now, so there's huge food security concerns. And part of the intent of this network is to bring together the different countries, everything from technical to political to institutional types of issues to address how agriculture and nutrition can be applied. And we started having some conversations in terms of how Earth observation data could be applied to that, looking both at from the perspective of national planning, but then also the more dynamic real-time data that can also be made available to smallholder farmers so that they're able to make more specific decisions at the plot level. Started having discussions with Stuart at Geoscience Australia and NASA and CEOS also on how data cubes could be applied to this. So there's been some work that's been going on in this in Africa already, but then thinking about what a regional approach to that might look like. And other issues around waste management and so forth. But looking broadly across the countries that we're working in, at the institutional level, there's a number of issues in terms of how you better cooperate across institutions, how you better engage with the private sector, what are some of the more innovative models that we can use for applying funding, and then ultimately looking at data literacy and capacity. Ultimately, if we're making all of this data more accessible, how do we better apply it and use it? And then on the technical side, in I think every country that we're working in, there are issues around data sharing and interoperability. Much of that is from a policy perspective that there isn't an enabling framework that allows for data sharing to take place across institutions, but that is definitely a big barrier in terms of the types of progress that can or cannot be made. And then, there's been consistent issues around how to address environmental data and how you can use geospatial methods within that. So we have three different working groups that we have established now in the partnership. One dealing with Leave No One Behind, which is essentially looking at marginalized populations, issues around data disaggregation, citizen-generated data. We have a working group on environmental data gaps. There's a common thread across all of that on the geospatial and Earth observation work, and then we're also doing some work around interoperability. So part of what we're doing as we're going through this is that it's a big learning process. And ultimately, what we're trying to do across countries is better understand what those lessons learned are, what are the methods that can be applied, do some level of experimentation, and where there are methods that are coming out either through methods that are being created by various partners, or as we test further case studies, make that available in a toolbox, which is essentially a set of resources, best practices, and guidelines organized by different data areas, official statistics, institutional types of issues. Another thing that we experimented with this year was a thing that we launched called API Highways. And this is really trying to empower the developer community by bringing together alternative data sources that can be mashed together such that you're able to create apps and visualizations that better support how the types of information that you can do and how that really leads to better action and decision making. So in this example, this is essentially protected areas with where conflicts have risen to just show the relationship around protected areas. And so I just wanted to end with a few points. One of the I think concerns is that the more that we continue to work within our own specific data communities and actually looking at the SDGs as a framework overall, there is the possibility of continuing how silos are perpetuated. So we have to be able to break down those silos and become more collaborative across different sectors. We need to be able to better embrace innovation and be okay when there's failures, as long as we understand and learn from those failures. We need to be able to work at multiple scales. So a lot of the SDG dialogue right now is happening at the national level, But when we think about where most people are going to be living, especially moving forward, those are going to be in urban centers. So the level of discussion in terms of the policy implications and the technical implications for how to bring national and subnational together, I think is something that there needs to be more work done on. Funding this whole process continues to be a major gap, especially in developing countries. So trying to think about how to look at more innovative funding models and to build public-private partnerships. There's a lot of work that's been going on for many years around public-private partnerships, but I think we also need to start having more case studies and evidence on what does and doesn't work around that. And then data literacy and capacity. We need to be able to, as we're talking about data, make sure that the data is effectively being used. So that's all I had to share. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Maybe stay here in the case there are a couple of questions.
Sure.
I have no idea how this works. It's on.
already on.
Okay. So thanks very much for that great presentation. It's really useful to see what lessons you've learned and what the major issues are, which I can see there are quite a few and quite big ones. So maybe we'll just open up for a couple of questions, if there are any from the audience. Hans-Peter, thank you.
Thank you very much for the very good overview of what the partnership is doing. My question goes in the direction we are focusing very strongly on the symptoms, on trying to deal with the problems we have, but we are not really using, in my opinion, the data to understand why we have these problems.
Mm-hmm.
So why do we still have poverty? Why do we still have people who are hungry? Why do we still have all these issues that we are having? And would you say that the global partnership is trying to also make data available to actually not just focus on the symptoms, but actually try to understand where the problems come from, and then maybe even go to the roots? The United Nations Research Institute for Sustainable Development is trying to talk about the implementation and do the research that's necessary for that, but I don't see the link between the data community and this research community that's very important.
Yeah. No, I think that's a really good point. I mean, part of our approach has been, I mean, it's this iterative approach that we're taking with our countries. And so much of this work started last year. And so some of these relationships with the countries have been close to 2 years at this point. And through that process, many of those issues that I kind of outlined are some of the major barriers as to why things are not the way that they should be, right? So for example, if you were looking at population distributions. In many countries, there is not a good CRVS system in place, so that 30 to 40% of the population is unaccounted for. And so when you have that sort of fundamental issue right there, then there's a whole set of other issues that touches on, right? And many of those, the reason that happens is often there isn't the right levels of funding that's taking place, there isn't the right level of capacity, and the level of coordination that's required across institutions isn't to the level that it should be. Now, that's still a symptom, and part of that is trying to figure out what is the policy that's required to bring these organizations together, and that's something that we're, slowly working away at.
Any other questions?
Good morning, everybody. My name is Bakomoman. I'm from West Africa. I'm working at Agreement Regional Center. I want to know exactly what global partnership is doing in West African countries. Thank you.
So in West Africa, we're working in Senegal, Ghana, and Sierra Leone. So the whole data roadmap process that I was talking about has been started in each one of those countries. Ghana was the last national workshop that it was the process that we started this year with them. And so we're continuing to work with each one of those countries, and we actually now have our program manager who's based in Nigeria, who's able to do much more interaction with each one of those countries addressing their challenges.
Okay, thank you. Thanks again for the presentation.
Great. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thanks. Okay, so we're going to move on now to more national level with this next presentation. Going back to my notes. So the next presentation will be given by Jai Rampasad from the Ministry of Agriculture, Forestry and Fisheries of St. Vincent and the Grenadines. This is the presentation. So thank you very much for coming all this way. I believe you're just here for a day, is that right?
Yes, correct. Yeah.
So it's great to have you with us.
All right. Good morning, everyone. As the presenter said, my name is Jai Rampasad, and I'd like to first of all thank you all for this wonderful opportunity. And certainly, welcome to everyone, welcome to all my colleagues, and it's a pleasure to be here, certainly. Before I start, I want to first of all apologize on behalf of the Minister of Agriculture for not being able to be here to actually make this presentation, but certainly I am a consultant for the OECS countries and will try my best to fill in. So as we get started, okay, so this has been tremendous movement in St. Vincent and the Grenadines, and by extension the OECS countries. They have been trying, but have been having a lot of problems to really implement the SDGs. Now, from St. Vincent point of view, there is a relatively small country, 110,000 population, but they have been doing a lot in terms of progression for the OECS countries. Now, the Millennium Development Goals and its effect on the OECS countries, and by extension the SIDS, the Small Island Development States, has been really, really difficult and really limited. While there have been a lot of successes globally, certainly according to the Millennium Development Goals report, there have been some issues that ongo, like gender inequality, the wage gaps, climatic change, and even conflicts in human development. But as the ministers that I deal with around the region, they basically said that their main issue is that they have a sort of hand-me-down approach with a lot of these development policies. I listened to a conversation that Mr. Alan Chastney, the Prime Minister of St. Lucia, had. And he was speaking on the United Nations Forum, and basically a lot of these policies, these sustainable development goals, really is a type of one-size-fits-all, and it doesn't really fix the need of the small island development states. You know, we have had a number of additional issues. I mean, I'm so glad to hear about data collection. That's a tremendous issue that we are having in the small island development states. And some of the reasons for that, it's because really and truly it's public sector driven. They don't really have the funds for the technical support. They don't have the infrastructure, the ICT support system to really get that data collected, get it analyzed properly, and get it live. And because of that, it's really difficult to implement. So I also reviewed the Samoa pathway, which also looked at the small island development states and the effects of these sustainable development goals in it. And as you could see, there are a number of limitations and requirements that these states need to really bring it to the next level and really take full advantage towards the SDGs. So, looking at the next step in terms of St. Vincent and the Grenadines, Minister Suboto Caesar spoke in the Pan-African conference, and he mentioned something called Geospaces. Now, this model basically looks at actually confining or making in smaller groups a geospace that you can concentrate your effort for the SDGs in. So I like to use the analogy, basically, for small island development states where you have these issues with infrastructure, where you have these issues with funding. These 17 goals are just 17, but it's like you're trying to move a mountain, right? And there's a lot of talk about the mountain. There's a lot of saying, yes, this can be done. But really and truly, what ended up happening is very little. So he came up with this ideology whereby you're using geospace. You confine a certain area between 5 to 10,000 individuals. This geographical space, you focus your limited funds there, you focus your policies there, and what works, you can expand it out nationally, regionally, all right? And so that basically you'll have more accountability, it's easier to implement. And these geospaces, right, really and truly can start as one and expand out in any different region. And with the proper support services, the ICT support, with the proper data support, these geospaces can be linked globally. So before I go more into the geospace, just the background of the thesis. It started when Minister Caesar actually went and spoke on the United Nations platform on behalf of them at the Pan-African Parliament in South Africa. And he was speaking about no hunger and came up with this concept. Now, myself, I work directly with the OECS, and I've been forming different models for them and actually try to develop the industry there using a lot of international data, trying to actually bring up the economy, which is very strongly agriculture-based. So I actually looking at the proper production planning, proper certification to really bring up their industry. And as this consultant, Minister Caesar run the idea through me, and I looked at it, developed the concept, looked at the matrix, looked at the framework, and we were certainly backed by Mr. Chad Blackman and Ms. Celeste Jules, and obviously some scientific support from Mr. Hans-Peter Plug. All right, so as I said before, a geospace is a designated area where you would want to intensify and organize your efforts to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. By confining this smaller space, what will tend to happen is you have an improved ability for data management, greater accountability management. It's easier to implement these goals, right? Rather than you simply just talk about it regionally and nothing happens, you can now confine it, you can now monitor it, you can now target your goals. You could expand it based on the successes, and I'll get into that where some successes actually was able to expand regionally as well. All right, so Mr. Caesar, last night, he asked me to stress on this point that this geospace, it can work, it is quite successful, but certainly we really need the funding and the initiative to really get it done and really put it into the different nations. All right, and obviously, it's very important to link the successes or to measure your successes. And I think that data reporting has been lacking. And certainly, based on the UN indicator frameworks, we basically created some metrics to really judge and measure the successes of the geospace. All right, so aside from that theory and on the basis of that theory, a lot has been done in the Caribbean region, in St. Vincent and the Grenadines specifically. Now, on behalf of the Sustainable Development Goals, the ministry in 2014-2015 actually set up the Ministry of Sustainable Development. So to really utilize and to really focus on these Sustainable Development Goals. To get the buy-in from the opposition, Mr. Caesar also created a parliamentary front. Now, a parliamentary front is where a certain idea or a certain development is actually utilized by both the opposition and political party in power, so that there'll be no conflict of interest. And because it's for the national gain, certainly the Parliament front is really the way to go, so that you will not get any political bias or political kickback. They also started the Zero Hunger Trust Fund, right, to assist with some of the funding. And basically what they did, every phone call coming out and in of St. Vincent and Grenadines actually have a 2% tax on it. And that additional funding was utilized to actually integrate some of the sustainable development goals in the country. And that is obviously to add to any assistance that they already get. Now, in terms of the environment, they even went further. Last year, they had bans, national bans on the use of styrofoam. They formed cooperatives to actually assist in agriculture billing, to reduce the risk, shared learning, and actually improve the crop. He met and dealt with Mr. Richard Branson, and they actually banned turtle meat. And while it's not a popular meat maybe in the US or other cultures, certainly wild meat or meat of that associate is huge in the Caribbean. And it's to really go and ban one of your cultural aspects, it's huge. Now, they formed the Geospace, all right? It's actually implemented already, the first one. It's basically 12 interrelated towns. It covers over 7,000 acres. And we actually have people from the ministry doing the surveys and interviews. And we judge the performance based on the metrics. And we are trying to measure it in line with the goals of 2030. Now, this here is the area that we are looking at to really concentrate the first geospace. We plan to have 15 more geospaces by mid-2018. All right, and just some basic information. We try to get it as homogeneous as possible, where you'll have some schools, you'll have health clinics, sporting facilities. We try to even get in some of the coastlines. So we'll get into really adopt most of the SDG goals as possible. One of the stars of this whole Geospace was the regional agriculture revitalization. And this is something that I, in my capacity as a consultant for the OECS countries, strategic planning and management, really took upon myself. The picture there is the presentation at the OECS ministers meeting. What happened, we actually looked to revitalize the agriculture system there. All right, it started in the Geospace, whereby we actually start to improve the crops. We start to look at what the market demands want and actually create that support structure to increase trade. I basically came up with this model, a new regional model that was really backed and supported in the Caribbean Week of Agriculture and the ministers' meeting, a people support market model, whereby we look at what the international market demands. We actually look at the production planning stage in the Caribbean. We actually look at what they are actually capable of and what is needed. And one of the key shortfalls between the market and the production is basically that support structure that is lacking, that infrastructure, that certification, that planning there to really create that linkage, and especially a key part of it would be the ICT technologies and the data planning as well. All right, so basically, to implement the Geospace, we created a framework whereby you would need to control the political support, financial support. You need to identify a specific cluster for that Geospace integration. Introduce the policies and practices aimed at achieving the SDGs in that political space. and monitor it and put contingency planning in place to really monitor the success or have accountability for the success of the geospace. So as we come into a close, and I think this conference is the perfect way to really speak about this, representing the small island development states. I mean, we saw what happened with the recent hurricanes of Irma, Maria. It destroyed most of the Caribbean countries. And it's really sad, especially, and it really felt it, especially for me, because I actually visit most of those states recently, speak to most of these prime ministers and ministers to really see their development. And after the hurricane came, I mean, 27 died in Dominica, 10 in Cuba, 12 in St. Martin. Barbuda, for the first time in 300 years, has nobody living on it. Thousands displaced. And, the talk of global warming before, everybody say, no, it's just a myth, this, and it's real. All right? You're seeing the heating up of the water. And because of that, when the tropical storms come from the African side, it continues to raise, and you get in these superstorms, and they're going to continue unless something is being done. I mean, the global warming effects is disastrous. 90% of Dominica are destroyed, and those are people, those are families, and, climate change is real, and it's very, very evident now, and it's something we really need to concentrate on. Right? Certainly some solutions. I was listening to Mr. John Finch in one of his presentations, and he was actually looking at the requirement for not only the public to lead in the climatic change, but for it to be a public-private partnership, for the institutions to actually put stronger policies and penalties for the fossil fuel or greenhouse gases. Because when you bring it more from a social aspect to economic aspect, you'll tend to get faster movements. Increase investment for clean energy. All right? So really is something we need to do, something we really need to make a key focus, I hope, of this conference. All right, so I just want to leave you with some of the photos of what is going on in the country in St. Vincent and what we have been doing. You see the cooperative dealing with some of the small farmers, the formation of the Geospace. They're actually looking to perform the metrics, to actually develop their crops, to actually reduce poverty, and really attack most of those goals. This is directly responsible from the regional agriculture model that we did. Previously, products was just packed in sacks like that. We increased, we started up a new processing facility. We got it FDA certified. We actually set up proper packaging standards, and you see a tremendous increase in quality. It moved from farmers selling just a few pounds by the market to now selling by the container loads to the United States, to Europe, to these other markets. And certainly that regional development model is something that I really want to press for some investment to really get it done, because it has been proven successful, it has been working in the region, and it can be adapted to other developing states as well. All right, and you can see some of the effects of the relationship between the different agencies. And we also had quite a bit of regional collaboration to not only develop the Geospace, but for this whole regional agriculture transformation plan. We met with Minister Chastney, Director General of all the OECS countries, to actually have that sit-down meeting. We had several press conferences. We met with Martinique, who will also be soon part of the OECS countries as well. So a lot of discussion has been done, and a lot of development to not only improve agriculture, but really target the SDGs in the small island development states. And I mean, the Lord has really been blessing us with a lot of guidance, a lot of good lucks, and we really hope to carry it forward and really bring the small island development states forward. But we certainly would need the assistance. We have the information, We know what is needed, but certainly we need the funding, we need the investment to really get it out. We need that collaboration, to really develop and bring forward. I mean, a simple thing like this regional agriculture plan, there's a global shortage in food. Development investment in all these countries could certainly not only increase food security for that region, but make it the breadbasket of the developed world as well. So I'd like to thank you very much.
Thank you. Could we just stay for a couple of more minutes if there are any questions? And thank you for a great presentation, really showing us what's happening on the ground and at the national and local level. I was very interested in the concept of geospaces and how kind of you need to implement really locally. Whereas
Correct.
in geo, we're looking more at the global picture.
Yes.
Any questions? Yeah. Thank you, Paul.
Yeah, thank you very much. My name is Chris from European Space Agency. So I was wondering, that concept of geospace is obviously very interesting. So you mentioned that you have in mind to have further geospaces.
Yes, correct.
One more question. So further geospaces on your island, or will they all be uniform in terms of space, in terms of their composition, or did you have some conversations with other islands that they would implement the same system? Would there be collaborations? That would be very interesting also from a more regional perspective.
Correct. So basically, as I can tell you, I'm a consultant for all the OACS countries. So I can tell you that certainly is in the planning stage. Now, specifically with St. Vincent and the Grenadines, one has been started. The minister advised that they plan to start 15 more by June next year. All right, so there'll be integrated 16 geospaces in St. Vincent and the Grenadines. Regionally, we've been liaising with the Director General, we've been liaising with the different ministries and governments. Dominica actually was going to start up one until the hurricane hit it as well, and similarly with Antigua. But we are very close with the other regions, and certainly there would be that directive to really introduce the geospaces in these other countries as well. Furthermore, with the correct funding and the successes, we're actually looking to capitalize it even more beyond the region, to make it global. Because I don't only think that this would be successful in small island development states. I think globally it will be as well. Because once you have that interconnectivity between the geospaces, you can look at what a geospace is doing in Africa, what has been working there, and with the link with the proper data management, with the proper ICT supports, you would be able to improve and really implement whatever is successful there in the small island development states, or what is working in Europe could work here, and basically create that interconnectivity with geospaces globally.
So I think, thanks again for the clarification. It's definitely very interesting. I think the transfer to other regions might be tricky, to be honest, because let's take Africa. There is, or also Europe or Middle East. The cities, right, that have more population than all your islands together, right? So even the entire island would be still a small geospace if you plug it in some other contexts. So that will be conceptually very interesting, how to design a geospace in a totally different geographical context to still get a representative thing somehow in that geospace, while not having to place it just in a rural area with a small town that is not representative for the geographical context.
Correct. No, I was speaking to the minister, and that's the beauty of this particular model. And that's actually the same question that was asked at in Africa when he made the first presentation. And that's the thing, because it's a geospace, it's a confined space, you don't really look at the amount of people in the island. 110,000 is relatively small. But you're looking at what could be gained, the lessons from that one geospace. So you have 10,000 people here, fine. But instead of just having 5 geospaces as you'd have in St. Vincent, Africa could have 100 geospaces. Europe could have another 50 geospaces, all right? And basically, you're not really looking at the entire population as a whole, but the performance of each geospace. And therefore, the benefits or policies of each geospace could be analyzed and modified. All right? The implementation in the other islands, as I said in several conferences before, is mostly agriculture/environmental-based conferences in the Caribbean Week of Agriculture and the Ministers' Meeting and the others. A lot of things that they say was not able to be done, we have been able to make it happen, such as the development of the regional agriculture trade. For 30, 40 years, there's only been talk what is needed. The market says, okay, we want products, you're not consistent, you don't have the quality. Production in these countries say that, okay, they don't have the investment, the infrastructure. They don't, but they're not getting the markets. We said, all right, we created this model, all right. We showed that the links with the market, exactly what the markets need. All right, we look at what is the strengths and weaknesses on the production, what is needed to ramp it up. All right, a lot of them are smaller farmers, so they are afraid if they plant more, their local market, they will not make any money. So they're afraid to really send it to the next level. When you could show them that there's a final market, they'll be more than willing to ramp up production. They'll more than be willing to make that investment. Once they have that market, they can actually get the loans, get all these other activities to really bump up that production there. What is needed, and a problem that they had, was that linkage with the market, was with that investment in that support structure that they don't have. You don't have, not everybody has the FDA there. Not everybody has ISO certification. You don't have a lot of HACCP certification. So without having that support structure, you really cannot meet that next market. So that is where the investment is. Now, we started the process in St. Vincent and the Grenadines, and trade increased drastically between Trinidad and Tobago first, regionally, and then trade increased internationally as well. So it has been working. With the transfer to the other islands, that has also been working as well, because when everybody now see the success of this venture, it hasn't been done in 30, 40 years, it's been done now. When they see the success of this venture, Dominica started to come on board, and they started to export as well with a similar system. Antigua wanted to come on board, and everybody was willing to come on board now. And they have been, the hurricane hit them, but we have NGOs being set up now to aid in that implementation. NGO and OECS control NGO is now being set up to actually look at that implementation there. So really and truly, the relationship between the islands, it can be done. Geospaces can be included, just as this regional agriculture model has been.
It looks like the next speaker is not here, so we have a little bit of time to continue this conversation. And I would like to add something else that the geospace or the real world space is being used for, and that's really the validation of policies. And so we are looking, for example, with the government in St. Vincent on how the public services need to be organized so that different sustainable development goals are being achieved. For example, energy service is not just being looked at from the point of view that we want renewable energy. We also want a system that helps us with poverty, that helps us with gender equality, and all of other things. And while this is something that the whole country has to do, the real world space, the geospace, can be used to validate the policies. And in this sense, it can be scaled up to other countries. A place where you really can do the data collection using citizen provided data and using Earth observation data to really see whether the policies actually are working. It's difficult to do this on a country scale, but you can do it in far more higher resolution in a geospace.
Okay. If there aren't any further questions, is this our next speaker? Sorry, you're not the next speaker. No. Would you like to be? Don't volunteer. Okay, well, thank you very much once again. I think we'll just move into Hans-Peter's presentation then. He gets an extra 5 or 10 minutes. So Hans-Peter Plagg, long-standing member of the Blue Planet Initiative Steering Committee. We'll be talking about SDG interactions and interdependencies and the role of the ocean.
Well, in this brief presentation, I would like to talk about a few points. And the first one is what it actually means to be in a position to operate a planetary system, because that's really what we are. We are talking about the Anthropocene, and the Anthropocene, the epoch of our making, means we are actually operating a planetary system, and that's a very, in my opinion, very challenging task. And then I want to make comments on the implementation of the SDGs, because we are talking most of the time in the geo community, we are talking about the monitoring of the SDGs, not so much about the Earth observation data in support of the implementation. Then I will talk about the interdependency, assessing. There a lot of work has been done how to assess the interdependencies, and I want to give a little bit of information on that. And then I will close with a holistic view on all of this. The one thing that I want to talk about here is, very briefly, is that when we look at the system state, the planetary system, there is a kind of a safe operating space that would be convenient for us. If the planet goes very far outside of this, it's not very convenient for us. And the current trajectory is not telling us that we are going to stay within the safe operating space. We are moving out of it very fast. And over the last 3 years, I've collected a huge amount of information about what is happening. And every day almost, you get new horror stories. For example, this one was 2 days ago, I think, in Huffington Post, based on a lot of different scientific investigations, that we have lost 75% of the insects. 75% means this is the most successful group of species the planet has ever had, and we have managed within a very short time to get rid of 75% of those very successful species. That should worry us. And talking about the Anthropocene, more and more people are understanding that maybe that's not the best epoch the planet has ever seen. We need to go to an Ecocene, and the question is, how fast can we do that? And this particular paper done by a conservation biologist said, if it takes too long, most likely human beings will not be part of the Ecocene anymore. So let's try to get out of the Anthropocene as fast as possible. How do we do that? Well, we have to do something. We have to have a desirable society, a desirable future, and we have this. We have really worked on that. But then we have to disturb the system. And we have to disturb it in a way that it exceeds the resilience of the system, because otherwise it just stays on its trajectory and goes on. But when we do this, most likely we will basically put it in a direction that's still not the one we really want. So we have to monitor, and then we have to make corrections. And it's an iterative process. It's a wicked problem. We cannot solve it. We have to monitor it all the time. And then after many corrections, hopefully we make it that we actually get to the future we want. But it's not given. It's a very difficult process to actually get by 2030 to have the Sustainable Development Goals achieved. And this iterative process needs both the science, the society, and the Earth observations to monitor where is the planet going. And this is a diagram that actually indicates something that I find very important, and the real world space comes in here as an important aspect. We have system knowledge, that's the traditional science, and we are very good in that. We can really identify what's going on with the system. Social science have provided us with a tool to get the goal knowledge. We know where we want to go now. The United Nations have agreed on something, and that's something that was done in a very well-defined process. But we don't have even the epistemology how to develop the transformation knowledge. We can't really. It's very difficult. We cannot wait until 2030 and then find out, oh, what we tried to do didn't work. So we have to find a different way of validating the policies that we want to implement. And that's really, the transformation knowledge is really the issue. And when we look at, for example, the United Nations Research Institute for Sustainable Development is really focusing on this. How can we actually make the transformational changes? And they, in this very important flagship report, they identify that we need to have a social term and we need to have an eco-social term, a social term. And that's really a big challenge for us. And they identified global challenges. poverty and hunger, climate change and environmental degradation, unsustainable growth and economic crisis, lack of access to technology, migration, flight, displacements, lack of decent work and social protection, health epidemics, inequality, exclusion, political instability, insecurity, and violent conflict. So there is quite a lot that is in the social area that is the big challenge. It's not so much the environment, it's really the social domain where we have the big challenges. And when I look at this, it's very interesting. They try to link the different things that need to be done: social policy, care, climate change, domestic resource mobilization, social and solidarity, economy and governance, to the different sustainable development goals. And I personally thought it's very interesting. How did they come up with that only climate change is related to SDG 14? So when you really look at this, they try to do a very comprehensive work, but most of the authors in this book are basically social scientists, so they don't see all the connections between SDG 14 and all the other SDGs and all these challenges that we see. And that's an important point to make. Another group that has been trying to assess the interdependency of the SDGs is ICSU, the International Council for Science. And they came up with a kind of a scoring where they say if two targets, are positively interfering with each other, we give it a +3. Basically, if they demand each other, if I can't do the one without the other one. And if it's less, then it goes down to 0. And if they are interfering with each other or excluding each other, then we get the -1, -2, -3. And then they apply this to a number of the SDGs, 2, 3, 7, and 14. And they get this very nice picture here that shows that there are many, many relationships between the different SDGs. And they rate all of them. But what I find very interesting to comment on is that it doesn't really tell us what we should do to handle those interferences and interdependencies. Actually, the group came up with a very special report for SDG 14, where they looked at SDG 14 and all the other SDGs, not all of them, but they looked at 1, 2, 8, 11, 12, and 13. And you can see that most of the interferences are positive. So they are actually helping each other, the different targets. But there are quite a number still that are negative. And again, we are not really sure how to handle them, how to address these interdependencies, when we think about that most of the time these different SDGs are in different departments in the government, so there are silos in the governments, and they need to actually address these interdependencies. Then there's another report focusing on 14. I was really surprised that so many of the reports looking at interdependencies of the SDGs that we found were basically all on SDG 14. There's very little, at least we could not discover a lot, focusing on specific other goals. SDG 14 seems to be of great interest for groups that look at the interdependency. And they came up with a diagram here. When you compare the two, the one that ICSU came up with and they came up with, they are almost completely different. So it depends on who looks at the SDGs, which interference and interdependency they see. There is no standardized methodology. Here we see, for example, I think in the other one, the small island developing states were not even included, but here we can see that the SDG 14 has a very big impact on no poverty, no hunger. It's also a very important impact on SDG 9. So we see a different picture depending on who is assessing the interdependency and what rules are being used. Another report on SDG 14. And this one looks actually and that's the left diagram, looks first at the interaction between the targets of SDG 14. Are there inconsistencies in the targets? And you can see that not all of them are blue. So some of them are red, which means it's a negative link, and green is both, could be positive and negative. So you see there's a lot of interaction, and then they look at the important links between target 14.1 and the rest of the SDGs. You have to do this actually for each target individually. It's a lot of work, but they take a point here, not a rating system, but a descriptive system. And then we have a report here that's actually not approved yet. It's not public, so I'm just showing it, but you need to forget it afterwards. And that's a report looking at how the SDG 14 has been implemented in the Caribbean, in the wider Caribbean region, and what the status is. And what I found very interesting is they come up and say the critical issues include overfishing, declining fish stock, loss of habitat and biodiversity, marine and land-based sources of pollution, invasive species, primary lionfish, climate change impacts. When I look at those, I would not call them really issues. I would say these are symptoms. These are not the causes. These are just the outcome of what is happening on land and what is happening to the atmosphere. So we have to really be careful whether we are only focusing on the symptoms or whether we are trying to understand the causes that made these symptoms come up. And very often we fall short in just sticking with the symptoms and trying to cure the symptoms. I was involved in a different way of looking at the interdependencies and interactions, more like this report that looked at SDG 14 and came up with a descriptive solution. So we are actually looking at describing all the different goals, the targets, and how they are linked to each other, but more without trying to rate it, without coming up with a number for it, but really coming up with a description that also entails, to a certain extent, a way of addressing it. A little bit more about the implementation. Last year we had a workshop in Berkeley, and at this workshop, actually we said we need probably do a paradigm shift from looking at all the things we can do for the SDGs and actually looking at the world through the eyes of the SDGs. And then thinking about, I'm an SDG number 2, for example. We have currently a lot of hunger. So how can we get to a world by 2030 where nobody is hungry? That's my task if I'm SDG 2. So I have to look at the world and I come up, who can help me? What should I do? Who is going to be impacted? Do I understand the challenges? What do I need to learn? Am I on the right track? All of these things is something we need to do through the eyes of the SDG. And when I looked at this yesterday, I said, well, there are 2 questions I'm missing. And one is, what do all the other guys need, all the other SDGs, in terms that I can, what do they need to do so that I can be successful? So what for example, does number, 12? Responsible production and consumption. What does this goal have to do so that I can be successful if I'm the ocean one? What do all the others have to do? And how is what I'm doing impacting all the other SDGs? I think we really need to put us in the position of trying to be this little guy down there to be successful in getting rid of hunger, which is a big, big issue for this little guy. And we are trying to do this with a workshop that we are going to have in January 17, 19, 2018, sorry. That is a mistake, my mistake. I did this early this morning, so a little bit too early. And we want to really look at basically what is humanity causing in the ocean, and how is what the ocean responding to this, and how is this impacting all the SDGs, and what are the governments needing to know about the ocean to actually be able to handle this. So that's a holistic approach, but I want to show you something where I looked at the past. What did we do in the past to get rid of hunger, for example? And maybe we can learn from the past that we are not doing the same mistakes in the future. So what we did is, we used a lot of fossil fuels to create more food. So we really looked at the fossil fuels to help us to change a solar-based agriculture with horses and cows and whatever into tractors and nutrients and all of this, which made it very difficult to have renewable energy, which basically destroyed or contributed to destroying the climate. And we accelerated the nitrogen and phosphorus cycle very much, extremely. And so responsible consumption and production was not our goal. Life on land was not necessarily the most important one. We changed land use. And clean water was not what we really were worried about. We didn't worry about the nitrogen and phosphor go into the water. As a result, we overloaded the ocean with nutrients, created a huge amount of dead zones in the ocean. So life below the water was not what we really were focusing on. So now we know that this created toxins. This documentary is really something everybody should see. The cyanobacteria are now they are more active than they were over billions almost years. And now they are creating a huge amount of toxins. And these toxins are most likely related to Alzheimer and other problems that are increasing rapidly because we have put so much into the ocean. At the same time, we overload the ocean with carbon. So again, not worry about life on underwater. And we are creating extinction in the ocean very rapidly. There's a very good study about this, and on the next slide I will say something about that. So, in the end, trying to have zero hunger, in the end we probably create a situation where we have more hunger. So we have to really be smarter than we were in the past if we want to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. And there's one, number 18. Oops, that was forgotten, but I think it's the most important one. And that's responsible procreation. We are not talking about that we cannot continue to be addicted to having a lot of children. We have to end this addiction of having 3, 4, 5, 6 children. We have to do something about responsible procreation. Otherwise, all of this is never going to work, and we have to do something about that. And how severe this is, for me, becomes clear when we look at the planet as a life support system. And the ocean is crucial in this life support system. And I was recently at a conference where the leading technology people with artificial intelligence and big data were addressing the many undiagnosed patients we have in the world. We have many people children who are dying, and nobody can say why they are dying. They are undiagnosed. In the United States, it's between 10 and 20 million people who are suffering from something that's not diagnosed. And these people were doing a great job to actually diagnose these people. And I said, well, maybe Earth is the biggest undiagnosed patient, and Geo needs to do something to diagnose the patient. And when you really look at this, all about this is about flows between us and the life support system, and these flows have accelerated in the last 100 years. And this is not something we can continue to solve the problem with the Agenda 2030. We need to change this rapidly. And I think what really should shock us is this diagram that was published, I think, 2 weeks ago by Rothman, MIT. He estimated what is the maximum load of carbon the ocean can take before a mass extinction event is unstoppable. And he estimated it's 310 picograms of carbon. And the current trajectory says this is something we will have reached by 2100. And when you look at the plus minus 50% estimated error, then we might actually be very close to. And that means the ocean will have no life left if we exceed this threshold. And that would be a situation where the ocean would no longer be functioning in the Earth's life support system. So I think this is something that should really worry us. And if you want, you can come and discuss this with us. Again, 2017 should be 2018. I think on the flyer it's actually correct. So we will discuss all of this at the workshop in St. Vincent in more detail than I could present it here. Thank you.
So the second session, or third, is now focusing on geo initiatives and the important participating organizations in terms of the Sustainable Development Goals in the small island developing states. We're going to start off with a presentation by Sophie Siev at POGO, the Executive Director of POGO, Partnership for Observations of the Global Ocean, also co-chair of the Geo Blue Planet Initiative, speaking on Geo Blue Planet efforts to support the Sustainable Development Goals. Sophie.
Okay, thanks very much for the introduction. Just waiting for the projector to
Oh,
wake up. But, thank you for coming back after the coffee break in vast numbers. What can I do in the meantime? Paul has
tell a joke.
Paul has already said it all. Any SDG related jokes anyone knows? No. Is it plugged in?
Nope, it's not plugged in. Right here.
That would be useful.
Just for future reference, one thing I do is, we deal in acronyms a lot of the time.
Yeah.
There's a good website called Wordsmith.
Yeah, yeah.
You can put in a series of letters and it'll spit out anagrams that are words. So that's always a good thing.
Okay. I'll bear that in mind.
That was Doug Wilson, for those of you who are curious about that contribution. Thank you, Doug. Okay, Sophie.
Okay, so I'm just going to introduce fairly briefly what Blue Planet is in the geo context. So Oceans and Society Blue Planet is the full title. It's an initiative within the Group on Earth Observations that's been around probably since around 2012, but in its current form since 2015 or so. So the Blue Planet mission is to advance and exploit synergies among ocean and coastal observation programs, to increase the integration of and access to in situ and remote sensing ocean observation data, to improve engagement with a variety of users for enhancing the timeliness, quality and range of services provided, and to raise awareness of the societal benefits of ocean observations at public and policy levels. So overall, the goal is to ensure the sustained development and use of ocean and coastal observations for the benefit of society, and particularly focusing on the cycle from observations through to the production of data, the transformation into products and information which ultimately generate knowledge, feeding back again into the user needs and requirements. So Blue Planet is very much a collaborative initiative. It's a network of networks made up of existing international organizations, as well as regional organizations, national institutes, universities, government agencies, projects, and other stakeholders. And we've tried as much as possible to include user representatives or agencies, as well as the agencies that are more on the provider side of ocean observations and services. So our governing structure, which was put in place earlier this year, consists of a steering committee of around 30 people from a range of countries, as you can see on the left-hand panel, left-hand image. But we also have a high-level advisory board of around 10 people from, again, a range of countries and representatives of users as well as providers. So we have, for example, representatives of governments in the Seychelles and Grenada. We have the NOAA chief economist and many other high-level people. We have a representative of UNEP as well. So one of the main focus areas for Blue Planet is really to connect the users to the providers of ocean observations. And this is very much was identified as a need by the international community. So there are many international organizations that deal with ocean observations. So there's the group on the Global Ocean Observing System, GOOSE, of IOC. There's my organization, POGO, the Partnership for Observation of the Global Oceans. But many of these are really dealing with the provision of ocean observations, but there's a gap in the link between the providers and the users. So this is very much the niche that Blue Planet has identified for itself, and this is the focus that the international community supports. So the main priority areas here are engaging with users to identify data and information needs, and also trying to clarify the landscape or seascape of ocean and coastal observations, and also the many projects and programs and organizations that are working in this area. Focusing more on the sustainable development goal side of things, there are a few initiatives starting up within Blue Planet. So one is the one that Hans-Peter presented in his talk, with the workshop on implementing and monitoring the SDGs in the Caribbean, the role of the ocean, which will take place in January next year. So the workshop is being planned as a collaborative effort between GEO initiatives, governments of Caribbean small island states, various UN agencies, and regional and non-governmental organizations. And it will bring together stakeholders engaged in the implementation and monitoring of SDGs, with the goal to link these efforts to required ocean observations and to engage in the co-creation of knowledge supporting these efforts. And the idea is that this is a pilot project taking place in the Caribbean, but that will then be transferred and adapted to other regions and other parts of the world. We also have been supporting the development of another project in the Caribbean in partnership with the United Nations Development Programme, UNDP in Barbados, and the Organization of Eastern Caribbean States, as well as IO Caribe Goose. And the plan is to develop a proposal for funding to implement a multi-purpose marine monitoring mechanism in the Caribbean between Barbados and Grenada initially, and that this project will provide the data and information necessary for successful implementation of the SDGs in the Caribbean, among other things. So finally, Blue Planet, as I already mentioned, is very much working with other organizations in ocean observations and services, and it's very much a collaborative effort. So we're working to facilitate linkages and exploit synergies with other organizations. So in the SDG context, we've been in dialogue with quite a few different partners, including some of the custodian agencies for SDGs, so the Intergovernmental Oceanographic Commission, the United Nations Environment Programme in particular, but also we've been invited to the OECD conference next month in Paris, which will address the blue economy, or the what they've termed greening the ocean economy, where there'll be a panel on sustainable development goals, and so we're working with OECD on that. And also there are quite a few other initiatives within GEO that are dealing with SDGs, and we're working very closely with them. So Blue Planet is in an ideal position really to try to bring together some of the GEO initiatives related to oceans and to SDGs in particular, as well as the custodian agencies and other stakeholders to try to bring together many of the activities that are happening around SDG 14. And I think that was my last slide.
Great.
Thank you,
Sophie. So we're almost on schedule, but take one question, if there's one for Sophie.
Thank you, Sophie. That was a good presentation. I'm curious about the 4M project, and I'm wondering if they are including some sort of biological observations, because most of these initiatives usually focus on the physical and biogeochemical parameters, but I'm wondering if they also are, or at least thinking about including biological measurements.
Maybe I could pass that over to Doug Wilson,
I think the
who's
answer
also
is yes.
involved. But
I think,
It's online. Yes.
Yeah, it's very much an integrated coastal sort of program in its concept. And I will say it's still a concept at this point, but it's being developed within that UNDP Eastern Caribbean framework. So.
I guess in coordination with the GOOS and...
Yeah. So yeah, I'm a GOOS representative here for the Caribbean, so correct.
and Doug, I think that the initial impetus is more so from an ecosystem perspective, isn't it? So they're very enlightened, I think, and that's definitely going to be a strong part of it. All right, well, let's thank Sophie and move on to our next speaker. Sophie
Which
can load
is-
up the presentation. So very kindly, we will have Enrique Montes Herrera, who is going to be speaking on behalf of MBON, the Marine Biodiversity Observation Network, and the MBON efforts to support the Sustainable Development Goals. If we get his presentation up on the screen. There we go. Excellent.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, everyone, for sticking around. And we're a small group, so if you feel free to interrupt any time. And I'm actually more comfortable with a conversation than anything else. And thank you, everyone connected remotely to this presentation. And I'll be talking to you about the GeoBond Marine Biodiversity Observation Network. This is a global effort, and the main objective of this initiative is to actually develop a community of practice that has its main focus on life on this, monitoring life in the sea. So I'm going to start by sharing these very interesting statistics that came out in a report from the OECD last year, pointing out that by 2010, the contributions for ocean-based industries to the global economy are somewhat between $1.5 and $2.5 trillion to the global economy. And by 2030, this amount might ramp up at beyond $3 trillion. And this is a staggering amount of money, and that's after including these emerging industries such as marine aquaculture, ocean renewable energies, and so on and so forth. And with the expansion of the ocean-based industries to the global economy, that will bring an expansion in the requirements for biological observations to try to understand how these industries are, or what the impacts from these activities in the ocean are on ocean ecosystems and services. So why is it important to understand or at least monitor marine biodiversity? And it's basically the focus is human health and economy, but it's also about understanding how ecosystems operate and how they respond to predicted and unpredicted disturbances. But and the key is how do we understand how life is changing in the ocean? And the main focus should be observations. It's really important to build an infrastructure in a collaborative manner that can allow monitoring life in the ocean through observation. A key partner of the GeoBond Marine Biodiversity Observation Network is the Ocean Biogeographic Information System. This is essentially the largest and most important data repository for biological observations across the world. And it basically spun up from the Census of Marine Life, which is it was a 10-year project that ended in 2010, I believe, and now it was transformed into the OBIS platform, which is under the Intergovernmental Oceanographic Commission at UNESCO. it's a very powerful tool. It hosts over 47 million biological records. And if you filter those by just the surface layer, you end up having a map like this. And it becomes very apparent that there are major observational gaps over large areas of the ocean. And the goal of the MBON is to try to address these information gaps across from either pelagic ecosystems and coastal systems. We're also thinking about issues with data latency. And if you look at the small plot on the upper right corner, that's the number of records through the existence of OBIS, and we see a big drop after 2010. It's not like biological records suddenly stop being collected. It's basically a lag of reporting biological data and being funneled into OBIS that it's a big problem. So if we want to understand how ecosystems and populations in the ocean are changing today over time, we need to address data latency issues. A second key partner of the MBON is the Global Ocean Observance System, and in collaboration with OBIS and GeoBON, the GOOS is contributing via two mechanisms. One of them is that the GOOS is currently defining the requirements for the biological and ecological observations that will feed into the essential ocean variables. And the second element that the GOOS is providing is probably the most comprehensive and ample observational global platform that exists today. And one of the efforts that we're focusing on through a partnership that was established in December 2016, there is now a formal collaboration between the MBON, OBIS, and the Global Ocean Observance System, is to coordinate the definitions for essential ocean variables and essential biodiversity variables that are being led by GeoBON, and make sure that these two organizations or initiatives are speaking the same language, so that we can ensure that the essential biodiversity variables from GeoBON feed into the essential ocean variables framework from the Global Ocean Observance System. Basically, we want to have a subset, having the EBVs being a subset of EOVs in the GOOS framework. And all of these EBVs and EOVs and data related to these indicators or observations being distributed across the world via OBIS. The Global Ocean Observance System has made very significant progress in defining EOVs for the physical environment, in biogeochemistry. Most of the parameters that they have defined as EOVs in these fields are at a mature level, but that's not the case for biology and ecosystems. These are the proposed or concept EOV variables for the Global Ocean Observance System, and the goal of the MBON is to ensure that these biological EOVs are in line with GeoBON's EBVs. So it's already becoming an acronym soup. On the GeoBON side, GeoBON has been working hardly on defining a set of essential biodiversity variables that can be detected via remote sensing, and those go from genetic composition, species populations, all the way down to ecosystem function. And some of them can be captured by satellites quite effectively. Things like, in the ocean, things like phytoplankton and primary production and so on and so forth. Those are mature, and we're not to worry about them. But there are some other variables that are in the process, or they have some limited capacity to collect some of these variables. With the expansion of new sensors, or what we call H4 sensors, with improved spectral, spatial, and temporal resolutions, we believe that some of these other EBVs will be able to be monitored more effectively with satellite constellations that are
planned to be launched in the near future. So the vision for the AMBON is to, for example, in the geographical domains like the entire Americas or the entire American continent, is to ensure that efforts that are already deployed, like time series stations and ocean observatories that exist all along the east and west coast of the Americas, are coordinated efforts, that they all collect data in a similar fashion using common standards, and that they are open to sharing information, of course. But not only a small set of observations, but it's observations or metrics of biodiversity that go from flow cytometry, flow through imaging, microscopy, phytoplankton pigment determinations via HPLC, genomics, etc. They all collect these key biodiversity variables that can be shared and can be collected under agreed standards, and then scale those in situ or locally collected observations through models based on remote sensing data like seascapes, which is the extreme right picture that you see in the slide. And that is one of the goals of the project, is to distribute these type of satellite products that can help understand or scale up in situ observations to much larger regional, even global scales. A key partner of the AMBON is the Integrated Ocean Observance System, which is part of the Global Ocean Observance System. And they put together this technology matrix and to indicate that many different taxonomic groups that we're interested in measuring and monitoring over time, which can be perceived as key indicator taxonomic groups of the ecosystem. There is technology that can already collect data for these parameters, and these go from optics and imaging all the way through acoustic, genomics, through things like environmental DNA. This is something that we're testing currently with a AMBON demonstration in the US, and other set of platforms all the way to satellite. So the way we see this is by having access to data collected from these technologies, but then making these observations available to a much broader community, such as resource managers and decision makers that are not familiar with the type of data outputs that come out of these observation platforms. So we are now launching today, actually, this afternoon, and I invite you to the Marine Biodiversity Observation Network session that is going to happen at 2:30 today, because we're launching a pretty powerful tool that allows to gather these disparate and complex data sets from independent programs, different observational platforms and technologies, and merge them in a single system together with environmental parameters or properties collected by satellite, so that we can generate outputs that allow management to understand how biodiversity and ecosystems are changing all the way from global scales to more local scales, and can help in the process of decision making. So the idea after this is not having to have the user being an expert on these disparate and complex data sets to make decisions, and actually be able to use these type of information to make decisions. And this is urgent. We're right now trying to assess the impacts of the Hurricane Irma. These type of disturbances are massive. They occur very quickly, and they take a big toll on the ecosystems. And we're not quite sure what the effects on the services that these ecosystems provide to our health and economy are. And we will start to understand what the changes in for example, the Florida Keys ecosystems were after this major hurricane, maybe some years after the fact. These are examples of satellite imagery that would be available through this tool that we're developing. And the one up here is, you cannot see that, let me see. This is imagery from MODIS before and after the hurricane, and this is this is Sentinel-2 satellite data, much higher pixel resolution, showing massive flows of waters carrying a lot of sediments from Florida Bay all the way to the Florida Straits, carrying a staggering amount of sediment and dumping those sediments from this area along the coral reef ecosystems. So these are pictures captured by Steve Giddings from the Office of the National Marine Sanctuaries from under a week ago. And this is how the Florida Keys look like today. Very murky with a very thick layer of sediments at the bottom, a massive die-off of sponges, either by physical destruction, like here, or by clogging by sediments and basically wiping out a large number of sponges that provide refuge and play a key role in these type of ecosystems. All the things that are already being detected is a staggering amount of sediments on the coral reefs. These not only affect the corals by limiting their ability to have access to irradiance, to light, but they also may trigger diseases.
Enrique, 1 minute.
So, 1 minute. A key element of the MBON is focused on capacity building, and this is being addressed by preparing joint workshops between MBON, OBIS, and the USIUS. And the topics included for these exercises are focused on biological data and metadata schema standards, how to deal with, how to report biological data sets in a way that is consistent with international standards, get a good grasp on the taxonomic standards that these data should be reported on, how to submit data to OBIS, because one of the things that we're trying to achieve is to incentivize people submitting data to OBIS to cover those large gaps in observations, and how to analyze this type of observations. And this initiative is being led by Frank Miller-Carter, Isabel Sousa Pinto, and Mark Costello. All of them are the three MBON co-chairs, and you can learn more about this initiative through this URL, and I can take your questions right now.
Great, excellent, very interesting, very important initiative. We could take a question for Enrique.
Thank you very much. You mentioned the impact of the hurricanes. Based on the data we have available, or even the theory, would you say that there's a difference of the impact the hurricanes have today compared to pre-pollution time? I mean, we have now plastic in the ocean, we have nitrogen and phosphor in the ocean, we have more carbon in the ocean, acidification. Do we already see a difference of the impact, or is it just the sediment load that probably didn't change very much? Could you comment on that?
Well, that's a very good question, and the short answer is I don't think we don't. What we know that the coral reefs in the Florida Keys have been declining steeply over the last 2 or 3 decades, and mostly due to a combination of pressures that go from nutrient loadings to warming, development, etc. But on top of that, you have these massive disturbances that basically limit the capacity of these ecosystems to recover from them. Basically, you're basically pushing their resilience to the limit, and coral reefs recover after a while, but if on top of that you have these other pressures, it complicates the picture quite a bit.
Great. All right, Enrique, thanks.
Thank you.
move to our last speaker of the session, and then before the panel. And we have Christoph Albrecht from European Space Agency and seconded to the World Bank. And Christoph will be speaking about space for the blue economy. And again, just a reminder, as Enrique mentioned, there is a MBON side session at 2:30. 2:30, yes. So encourage folks to participate in that. I'll be there, so it's going to be very interesting, very exciting work. Okay, and without further ado, there we go, Christoph.
Okay, so thanks a lot. Can you hear me? So this is for those of you who were at the Blue Planet Symposium in June, it was. This is you know part of this, but I updated certain aspects and also had further discussions with my colleagues at the World Bank, who we are now increasingly working with on this topic. But I'll get back to that in a little bit. Also, a lot of the input comes from Gordon Campbell from ESA, my colleague who is managing and coordinating most of the work we do on the ocean side. So I personally sit at the World Bank, as Paul already mentioned, representing ESA there to coordinate the collaborative activities related to sustainable development as a whole. So I will get back to this in further slides. But before, because you said we need an SDG joke, right? I still added one, so you know.
Outstanding.
And so this is like the World Bank joke. And you know, I don't know if you can read it. Welcome to this UN World Bank IMF PowerPoint presentation, and on the new Millennium Goal and extreme wealth, right? So not poverty, but what was it at the bottom there? In the last year, 10% of the world's population owns 85% of the world's assets. We need to change that. Anyway, nobody's laughing, so I guess I didn't somehow transfer the message.
It's an A for effort, so thank you.
Exactly, I tried. Okay. Back to the serious stuff. So the ocean in a development context, our community is probably mostly aware of that. It's crucial for many aspects, be it food, livelihoods, climate. There are a couple of really staggering numbers, like coastal areas within 100 kilometers of the ocean account for an estimated 61% of the world's total GMP. Fisheries, aquaculture, and so on, they ensure livelihoods of more than 10% of the world's population. This number was already mentioned in the previous presentation, that $1.5 trillion, which is assessed as the global ocean's wealth, according to OECD. I wanted to highlight a little bit, focus on the Caribbean, because we will increasingly focus on the Caribbean over the next 3 years. Fisheries sector generates $1.2 billion, in annually in export earnings. Tourism, $47 billion, and oil and gas is also something to be considered, $40 billion. So these are, big numbers, and even if the environment tends to be neglected sometimes in political decisions, the money often is the decisive factor. So how we work with the World Bank a little bit. World Bank addresses the ocean in various ways. Obviously, there are a lot of different aspects that contribute to that. But I give you a little bit of an intro on how this is structured in the World Bank, and this has changed already since June again. So we have the blue growth portfolio in the World Bank as part of the Environment and Natural Resources Global Practice, which is again linked to the Sustainable Development Vice President Unit. And this is in the World Bank. So the World Bank Group as a whole consists of the World Bank and the IFC, the International Finance Corporation. So the World Bank is the public sector. IFC can be understood as the private sector. So the sustainable development thing, where the blue growth portfolio is nested, is within the public sector. So the governments are the prime counterparts. So not necessarily focusing a lot on the social aspects, what Hans-Peter mentioned. So the social is mostly linked to the human development vice president unit. So you see, and these are also silos, obviously. There are cross-cutting aspects that are, they try to consider, but often it's in silos. So this Blue Growth portfolio in the World Bank has a volume of 6.4 billion per year. So 1 billion goes into sustainable fisheries, aquaculture, and so on. And this actually has been increasing substantially over the past couple of years. So if you look back to fiscal year 2003, there was almost no financing, no investments in this. And by now we are at 1 billion. But still, the largest chunk of the money goes into infrastructure issues, right? So into investing into sustainable infrastructures. But that includes waste treatment, watershed management, anything that reduces coastal pollution, and so on. A couple of projects, or it's actually not projects, it's more programmatic structures in the World Bank that are related to the blue economy. One is the WACA program, the West Africa Coastal Areas Program. It involves, many more things than the oceans. It's anything related to coastal, a lot also related to disaster risk management in coastal cities. What you see here, for example, is how the coastline actually changed over the course of just a couple of years. And on the bottom, you see how actually sand is extracted from the ocean as a resource. And this is often, or many times, not legal. Another thing, the Pacific Islands Oceanscape program, pretty big and comprehensive program that focused on fisheries, climate, fisheries habitats, and general regional monitoring and assessment. And obviously the blue economy in the Caribbean, so the Caribbean Oceanscape program has attracted a lot of attention. Most recently is also being scaled up, and we are actively involved in this now. We means the European Space Agency. And there's this statement in a recent report that actually my colleague Pavan, who was actually supposed to do this, and I'm standing in for him, is his statement. So investing in ocean health is synonymous with generating ocean wealth. And a lot of this is trying to be, they try to integrate this into operational processes in the bank now. And they see it as kind of the blue economy, like as they define it, they see it as that there are two parallel streams. One is actually the ocean economy, which is growing, and on the other hand, the ocean environment and the health of the ocean environment is declining rapidly. So these are two contrary streams, and the blue economy would be, understood as a ocean economy that is in balance with both ocean health and economic activities. So they shouldn't outperform each other, but work in concert. So how are we, the European Space Agency, addressing it? We have our Earth observation program, and I guess probably I don't need to explain a lot of that. Just one thing I want to say is it's really, many in the ocean community talk about Sentinel-3 as the ocean sensor, right? But I was quite happy to see actually a Sentinel-2 example in the previous presentation. So there are a lot of sensors in the Copernicus family that can be relevant for ocean monitoring, be it Sentinel-3, Sentinel-2, Sentinel-1 as well. And now with the atmospheric sensor just recently being launched, Sentinel-5P, that also has linkages obviously to that entire sphere. And I should add, all of the data is free and open. So this is like the flagship program of the European Commission and ESA together, and there's a free and open data policy, so anything is accessible. I was also it was interesting to hear a notion on future commercial satellites that may be able to fill in some gaps, and I added another slide on this. So in Europe, we have actually a few constellations planned that might be very interesting in addressing some of these gaps. So we have a hyperspectral one, HyperScout. We have the Earth Eye constellation that is already ongoing with TripleSat, and we have ICE-Eye, which is a new radar constellation that is planned. So there's a lot of developments going on, and a lot of these will hopefully be, used for the good in addressing some of our concerns. Back to the non-commercial world, so to where we are sitting with the Copernicus family, with the Sentinels. Obviously, opening of the Landsat archive that USGS and NASA did in the mid-2000s was a key step, right? So it really increased the uptake of satellite data. And there are few studies that assess the economic benefits of this, and they are huge. But still, as we always say, open data is not on open access is not the ultimate goal, right? So open data does not equal free information. Okay, you can have the data, but you still need to extract it and you need to do something with it. And we have massive amounts of data. So the Sentinels, just Sentinel-2, collect several terabytes per day. So you cannot keep downloading individual scenes and process it. I mean, you can, but the main value lies in accessing the temporal archive, accessing seasonalities and so on, and you really should move this to the cloud, right? So that's the idea, and I like this quote of Chad Sundwell from Amazon. They are trying to make free data cheaper, right? So they actually provide the processing environment to decrease your processing time and actually give you more time to focus on the actual stuff you want to do. And we have ESA, we have our own approach to this. We call it the thematic exploitation platforms. The concept is really bringing people to the data as opposed to getting the data to the people. So everything is on the cloud. We have the environment, the architecture, but it's really all about a community building. So there are specified tools developed. Everything is open source, and at different levels of expertise, we try to work with the stakeholders, with the end users, and bring all these new capabilities down to the end users. And a few of these thematic exploitation platforms can be relevant for ocean-related topics, be it the hydro, the coastal, geohazards, urban as well. A little bit on what we do with the banks. So we have a pretty long-standing engagement with the international financial institutions. World Bank probably being the main partner, but we do similar things with other development banks, especially the Asian Development Bank, IFAD, some of the Europeans. Now also we have a new agreement actually with the Caribbean Development Bank, which is quite interesting as a complementary action also with IDB and World Bank. So we will be quite active in the Caribbean. A few examples, and I will probably go a little bit faster on these because many of you have seen these already. So these are just some of the studies we did over the last couple of years with the World Bank. So these are all World Bank examples. This was, benthic habitat status, sediment transport mapping for India. Another story, in Mexico, we assessed coastal watersheds. How basically nutrients drain into the river system and that then discharge into the sea, and trying to aim at a more holistic approach. This is my favorite one. So this was a coral degradation assessment in Tuvalu, where the local inhabitants actually claimed that the massive, very fast coral degradation was linked to climate change, and then actually the World Bank was tasked to assess this, and they in turn actually worked with us to do it, and we figured out that this anomalous pattern actually could not really be statistically significantly linked to the climate change. So there must be another reason, and we checked it, and we found that actually there was the decline affected a certain type and species of fish that the local inhabitants liked eating. So there was less of this fish available. The other fish that were there, they didn't like eating. So actually they started farming pigs. And actually with the increase in pigs, the discharge of the pigs that went into the ocean, massively increased the coral degradation, and this was kind of this vicious cycle. So we were able to recommend to the World Bank that they should reduce the pig farming, and then actually they managed to get this back on to a previous status.
2 minutes, Christoph.
2 minutes? Okay. So Another thing, Western Indian Ocean, a marine highway where we tried to help them address certain piracy issues. Regional fisheries program where we link radar data with automatic transponder information from the ships to address illegal fishing. Coastal erosion, we've mentioned that already. So to summarize or to conclude, so this is our approach, how we deal with the development banks. We kind of still in phase 1. We had a phase 0 that lasted for a couple of years, did a lot of pilot studies, and now we are in a much more strategic engagement where we work with the development banks to help them get more efficient in the use of satellite data. And we now start one dedicated cluster on marine environment and coastal resources. Now means actually in December, and we have a 3-year time window where we'll engage with them in a quite strategic manner. So this is our current portfolio with the banks just in urban, water and agriculture, and there will be much more now coming over the next 3 years in oceans, disasters, climate and fragile and conflict states. So thanks again.
Okay, excellent. Thanks, Christoph. Can take a question for Christoph, and then we'll go to the panel. Questions? Sophie?
Just a quick one. On the last slide that you presented, EO4SD, is this an ESA initiative?
Yes. Yes, so this is an ESA initiative where we work with the development banks and other international financial institutions. So ESA basically, so how it works is we don't do most of the stuff in-house, but we actually contract a consortia of expert partners from the European Earth Observation Service sector. And they form a consortium in a specific topic. So we have 3 of these active. One is urban development, one is agriculture and rural development, and the other one is water resources management. So for each of these topics, we have one consortium, highly specialized, that has been facilitated by ESA, funded by ESA, guided by ESA, and works strategically with the banks. Strategically means we don't impose on the banks what we think they should do, but we try to understand in an iterative process where their priorities are, and then we engage in these projects or programmatic areas. So yeah, that's how it works. It's one of the ESA initiatives in the sustainable development broader domain. But, yeah.
Thank you.
Okay. Christoph, why don't you have a seat, because you're part of the panel?
Oh, we have the panel?
Yes, we will.
I see.
So we're going to say, first, let me thank all the speakers from today's sessions. Thank you. And now we're just going to finish the side event just with a panel of Christoph and Jay and Sophie. I'm going to ask you to join too with folks that are, and Hans-Peter, you want to join?
I thought I was monitoring it,
Oh, go ahead. Oh, no, please. Please.
That's what Emily said.
Okay.
And we always do what Emily says. Okay. You can sit down. I can.
Is that for me? Yeah, thanks a lot.
Yes. Okay, so in this panel we would like to basically ask the panel members a few questions, and then we will open up for the audience to ask additional questions. And I would like to start by asking Jay first. What you already commented in your presentation on it, but maybe you can remind us of what are the major data and information gaps in your country and in the region, in the Caribbean, that the international Earth observation community could support.
Hi. Good morning again, everyone. All right. Certainly, speaking on behalf of the SIDS and the small island states, there are a number of data gaps, and it has been causing a lot of problems. The main reason is that a lot of the information collection is really being done on a public sector basis, meaning that it's government run. And the problem with this is because of the shortage of funding and because of other engagements that the public sector have, it really not in the forefront of government policies in these developing states. And therefore, you don't really see that desired performance. And the case in point is that most of the ministries that actually oversee the collection of data and sustainable development goals is not the main ministries. It's not the Ministry of Finance, it's not the Ministry of Energy. It'll be like the Ministry of Agriculture. These are the ministries that doesn't really have the directive to really push the process forward. I think another issue is the lack of technical support. I don't believe that, especially in the public sector, they really have the ability or the qualifications to really analyze the data. Even though they also have the information gaps in collecting the data, even the analysis is an issue there as well. In a review of it, certainly infrastructure, ICT support systems are not there. And without this basic support structure, really and truly the collection, the monitoring, the accountability and accessibility of the information is not there. And you really need that support structure to really be put in place for you to monitor the data properly. So certainly there are the information gaps. The data is not live, and I think that is why it's so hard in the small island development states to actually ascertain how well the SDGs are being implemented. As a consultant on behalf of the OECS countries, I mean, you're seeing the constant problem, the inconsistencies, the inability for planning, accountability problems, monitoring issues, and delays with the data. So certainly there's a need for investment there.
Thank you. And Christoph, I would like to ask you now, based on what you just heard and what we discussed earlier, what are the major challenges that ESA and the World Bank have faced in the effort to help the developing countries and also particularly the small island states? Maybe you can comment on that.
Sure. So this is not on anyway, so I try to be loud. Oh, it is on.
You can have this.
It is on. So, I mean, there are a few challenges along the way, probably, and they address various aspects of the problem along the value chain. So data access is, I agree. I mean, I'm talking on it from the satellite perspective now, right? So data access has improved massively over the last couple of years, in particular with the Copernicus program. So there's a lot of data access, free access. The problem, I think, is more the uptake of the data in the development community that then actually supports the client countries. So let's take the World Bank as an example. I mean, there's a lot of excitement and increasing excitement on, use of satellite data, use of geospatial analytics, but not necessarily an in-depth technical understanding always, right? So they get all excited about using, seeing a very high resolution image, and then they say, oh, we need to work with 30 centimeter images because they think that must be the best because it's the most expensive and the most fancy. They do some pilot studies if they don't get proper guidance, and they might even find a few good conclusions, but then when it comes to scaling, they realize this is not scalable, right? So because it's just too expensive, the opportunity costs are just it's not scalable at all. So what we try to promote within the development community is really that fit for purpose thinking along the data to information product to information service line. So whatever you can do with open data, do with open data. And if you cannot address it with open data, then take it step by step. Go for the least expensive version first, and because in order to keep it scalable, very different approach to the intelligence community, for example, right? So they always usually go for the highest. So this is, I guess, one of the main challenges, and also that understanding of that data is not the end goal, right? So, okay, you have data that can be free, but you still need to have some investments and a technical understanding, capacity building, awareness raising, training in how to actually make use of the data. So, and that can be either a one-off, analytical solution, which I call information product, some map, that may help you to make a decision, but it's increasingly moving towards continuous services, right? So making use of the temporal data flow to have a continuous pipeline that informs your decisions. And that is a totally different setup, both technically and conceptually.
Thank you. And having heard this, Sophie, how would you see the added value of the Blue Planet initiative, and where do you see the role of fitting between the user, the stakeholders on the one side, the societal ones, and the space agencies and the World Bank as a kind of a provider?
Well, I think Blue Planet can be I think we used the word incubator previously, and kind of matchmaker, bringing together the different pieces of this puzzle. So we have links to many of the providers. I think where Jai said that there's a lack of infrastructure and access to data and so on. There are a lot of data out there that Blue Planet has links to, but also on the other hand, where Christoph said that data isn't the end product, Blue Planet can help to bring that data and into products and services that can then be brought to the users. So I think Blue Planet is kind of in the middle somewhere between the users, the providers, the scientists, the governments that need the information, and okay, sorry. So yeah, I think basically Blue Planet can be central link between all the different pieces, the providers of data, the scientists that are generating a lot of the data, and on the other hand, the users, the governments that need the information to be able to respond to the Sustainable Development Goals.
Thank you. And one last question to you, Jay, before we open for very few minutes for the audience, because we have only a few minutes left. And the question is, after you heard all of this, where would you see the main role of the geo community, in meeting some of those challenges that you described? Is it the matchmaking that is lacking, or is it really the capacity and the infrastructure that is more important to generate matchmaking? Would that be enough?
I think it's a combination of both, basically. I think basically the matchmaking is one part of it, but again, you do need that ICT support system. You do need that live data. Another model that I brought forward to the Caribbean is another model I developed, the PESM model, which was developing the local agriculture system. To link the markets and to link the production, you actually need that ICT support to have that data live. There's no such support or infrastructure of that magnitude in the Caribbean, and while you need to look at the cost factor, for you to really be effective, you need some sort of infrastructure in place. Again, it doesn't have to be the most expensive, but really and truly to get that data collaborated properly, other than just the linkages, other than just the technical expertise, you need that infrastructure in place. In addition, I would also suggest, as Christoph was saying, some workshops to really assist in terms of the technical aspects, to really educate some of the local population there, in addition to the experts, to really let them be more ingrained in what is required to analyze the data, to improve the stats, so that instead of always have that given attitude, they could self-develop to start to provide for themselves as well. And I think, that's the way to go. Infrastructure, ICT support, workshops, the training, and I think that matchmaking that you speak of is exactly what the small island development states need to really bring it forward.
Thank you very much. And okay, I think, the concept that you described in your presentation, Christoph, with bringing the users to the data can address some of both the capacity and the infrastructure problems. So maybe you want to comment on that as well, and then we really let the audience ask some questions.
Absolutely. Actually, it fits nicely to what I wanted to say anyway. So You mentioned, the capacity building, the feeling ownership within the actual local or the stakeholders at the local level. I think that's absolutely crucial. So, and that's also what we are trying to do in this engagement with the development bank. So it's not the goal to just train the World Bank, technical teams to be able to do that. I mean, it's a intermediate goal, but the real goal is to transfer it down to the clients, and the clients are basically the countries, right, of the development banks. So, and that's why our teams, they join missions. We have trainings in the countries, we help them, and we try to make this sustainable also once the World Bank project is over, right? So that's the idea. And what you mentioned with bringing the data, the people to the data, so these thematic exploitation platforms, they really have basically the same goal. So we really want to address the needs of the end users. We classify the end users actually in different levels of technical expertise, which is also interesting and important because, okay, you have many platforms and cloud processing environments. I mean, they are blooming, right? So you can do anything you want on Google Earth Engine, but most likely a civil protection agency, a fisheries ministry, they will not have the technical capacity to do their own coding there, right? So actually what we do is we have standardized tools. A user can upload its own algorithms if he wants, but he can also use the tools that are readily available there. So we try to train also according to different levels of expertise. And actually we have the idea of doing such a regional activity also in the Caribbean now very soon. So I hope to collaborate with you then.
Okay, fantastic.
Okay, thank you. 3 minutes left for audience questions. Yeah. Okay. Anyone who wants to? Each question 1 minute.
Christopher, about the TAP initiative, how flexible is it to assimilate other type of satellite data that are not necessarily coming from Copernicus?
Oh, totally. Okay. Totally, yeah. Brief answer.
Very good. So I see 2 more questions.
Christopher, one more with the TAP. How does that compare to, I guess, to the SNAP software?
Mm-hmm. Well, they are linked. The Snap and STEP, so that this is referring to toolbox developments, right? So we have specific toolboxes that address Sentinel-1 data, Sentinel-2, Sentinel-3, and these are kind of compiled in the Snap environment. But the TAPs are really more a platform for community building as well, right? So there are specified tools for specified communities, whereas the STEP is more specified for a sensor type. So that's, I guess, the main difference. But yeah, in the TAPs we integrate, we try to also prepare tools for other sensors, right? Even for future things that are not available yet, like high altitude drones, right? So, which will, have continuous data flow and high resolution. We try to already prepare tools for these developments as well. So it's totally not only on Sentinel data.
And the last question.
Doug Wilson, Caribe Goose. There's a lot of satellite people here, and we're talking a lot about satellite and data and use of data. But I think we don't want to forget the need for in situ measurements and local, not only for the data itself, but for the engagement of the users. And one of the things I noticed, if you looked at the MBON technology matrix, that was a very first world matrix. There was a lot of very expensive equipment on there, and I think there's an overall need to address the ability for small island developing states to collect data about their environment locally, and we need to be thinking about new tools to improve that capability. And this is a big theme, but I think it's important.
Well, that was more a comment, and thank you very much.
Can I respond?
Sophie, you want to respond to it?
Use that instead.
Okay. I totally agree with that comment, and I just wanted to respond that there are some initiatives that are addressing this, particularly the G7 group which is working on the future of oceans or whatever. So there's a working group within that's addressing capacity building for developing countries in terms of trying to develop cheaper technologies. And also POGO, actually, we have an alumni network from our training programs that have been funded by the Nippon Foundation. And we have a group of our alumni who are working on developing a cheap CTD out of Russia. So that's another initiative that may hopefully go somewhere.
Okay, thank you very much. Unfortunately, we didn't have more than 20 minutes for this panel. Considering this, we didn't even introduce the panelists and didn't waste time on that. So I would like to thank everybody for this very efficient and very informative panel. And now we have all to run to another event. Those who are still watching the streaming, we have to leave now and go to another event and continue there our discussions. Thank you.